Thursday evening, 6th of May, 1937. Lakehurst, New Jersey. The sky is lit up with a blinding sheet of flame, intense heat stinging the eyes of wide-mouthed onlookers as the largest airship ever built and the pride of a whole nation comes crashing down to earth in a pile of twisted metal. How had this happened? What had caused the horrific tragedy that had taken place in almost the blink of an eye? Join us as today Descent into Darkness explores the Hindenburg Disaster. Background and construction. Lighter-than-air flying vessels have existed for a lot longer than most people would think. The hot air balloon, man's first successful attempt at flight, were being used as early as the mid-1700s. But it didn't take long for many to realize the utility of this wondrous new technology. During the American Civil War, for example, hot air balloons were used to get a bird's-eye view of a battlefield or besieged defenses. Today, we would differentiate the hot air balloon or any similar frameless vehicle as a non-rigid airship. But during the Civil War, a German man would get his first look at the balloons and see the potential for improvements. This man's name was Ferdinand von Zeppelin, whose name would soon become synonymous with airships, and he founded a company bearing his name. He went on to design a lightweight frame with canvas stretched over it acting as a skin. Inside the frame would be large gas balloons, utilizing gases that were less dense than air. More on this in a bit. This design would become known as rigid airships. Due to von Zeppelin's pioneering work in the industry, Germany had a fantastic head start and quickly emerged as the world leader in rigid airship technology. With this came a great deal of prestige at being the number one player in town. The gargantuan airship, the Hindenburg, began life in the drawing offices of the Zeppelin Company in 1929 to a design drawn up by chief engineer Hugo Eckener. Airships were fast becoming the way to travel, as so many rich and famous pounced on the opportunity to be seen travelling aboard the new technology. Ocean liners were just so passé. Airships were the in thing. Eckener had previously designed an airship for the US Navy, named the USS Los Angeles, as part of a larger ploy to lobby the US government into dropping the part of the Treaty of Versailles that restricted Germany's ability to build large airships. This gamble paid off, and the US agreed to waive the restriction, and Eckener could get to build his massive crafts. This would soon be followed by a passenger-carrying airship named the Graf Zeppelin, as a nod to the company's founder, which entered service in 1928. Eckener had initially some trouble raising the money to finance the build, and there was no point in approaching the German government at the time as they were broke thanks to having to pay reparations to the Allies from the Great War. Undaunted, he decided to start what was essentially a massive GoFundMe campaign, inviting private donations from the public, which was able to raise the capital needed to make his dream a reality. The next year, in 1929, the Graf Zeppelin would become the first aircraft to complete an around-the-world flight, captained by Eckener himself, who became quite the celebrity as a result. But even as the Graf Zeppelin was wowing crowds during her first flights, Eckener was not content to stop there. He envisaged an even bigger and better airship that would be the ultimate way to travel. To show off the prowess of the newly created Nazi German state, this new aircraft would be the last word in luxury, and of course a brilliant advertisement to the world for Hitler's regime, complete with the obligatory swastikas. Germany had led the way with the technology during the First World War when they used airships for high-altitude bombing raids on Britain. Now, in peacetime, although the situation in Europe was beginning to heat up again, the country was keen to show that they were still the airship experts, especially when the British had had a go at their own, dubbed the R-101. Construction began on the new craft in 1931 and would take 5 years to complete. The Hindenburg was named for the late German President and Army General Paul von Hindenburg, and it was to be the largest aircraft ever built to that point and remains, to this day, the largest airship ever built. The massive envelope would be 804 feet long, only a few feet shy of the size of the Titanic. She towered above the ground at an impressive 135 feet 1 inch in diameter. It would be powered by 4 reversible 1,190 horsepower Daimler-Benz diesel engines, which would power the ship along to a cruising speed of 78 miles an hour, although she could achieve a maximum airspeed of 84 miles per hour. The envelope itself could hold around 4.9 million cubic feet of gas for lift, and the whole craft weighed 242 tons. The frame was made of lightweight aluminium and had hundreds of miles of internal strengthening wires covered over with a skin of cotton canvas impregnated with a mixture of cellulose acetate butyrate and aluminium powder to make it impermeable to water, the aluminium powder in the fabric giving the airship a metallic look. The 16 internal gas balloons, known as cells, would be made of a new kind of material first pioneered by the Goodyear Company, which was a type of gelatinized latex. This replaced the previous method of using what was known as goldbeater's skins, which was made of thousands of animal intestine membranes, usually from cattle. The new material would be much quicker and far less labor-intensive. The ship would be piloted from a car slung beneath the craft, known as a gondola. Toward the forward end, at the bottom of the frame but inside the envelope, was a large accommodation area that could accommodate 70 passengers and 61 crew, a lot of whom would be passenger attendants, restaurant and bar staff. There were windows that allowed the passengers to look down upon the world as they floated on by. The interiors were all designed by leading architect Fritz August Brehaus, who had previously worked for the Pullman Carriage Company and had designed interiors for several German stately homes. The low passenger capacity of the Hindenburg lent to a feeling of exclusivity that appealed to the wealthy people who were lucky enough to get themselves a ticket, which cost the equivalent of between $7,000 to $9,000 in today's money. Gas. Of course, we must discuss just how the Hindenburg managed to get its massive bulk airborne. Those of you who know your science will know that helium is much less dense than air, which is why helium-filled balloons will rise high into the sky if you let one go. However, helium was, and still is, very expensive and difficult to manufacture, but there is one gas that is even less dense and much cheaper to make: hydrogen. But of course, hydrogen is inflammable, whereas helium is inert. The British, with the R101, had decided to go with hydrogen for lift, allowing for a far greater lifting capacity and can be easily created via electrolysis of water, liberating the hydrogen from the oxygen by breaking the covalent bonds. Indeed, just as the construction of the Hindenburg was beginning, on the 5th of October 1930, the R101 would catch fire and burn up rapidly, just like the Hindenburg would go on to do 7 years later. Whoop, spoiler alert. It would seem, then, that the lessons of the R101 were not heeded. Naturally, the inflammable nature of hydrogen was widely known, and so initially the Zeppelin company had the idea of making 14 of its 16 individual internal gas cells as double-walled, an internal cell of hydrogen surrounded by an outer one filled with helium, which would, in theory, protect the hydrogen from any spark that could ignite it. The problem is that the world's foremost producer and exporter of helium was the USA, and in 1927 they had passed a law strictly controlling the export of the gas. And so, despite the known inherent dangers, the Zeppelin company reluctantly went with hydrogen for the new craft. However, there was the side benefit of using the more dangerous gas. Given its greater lifting capacity, the use of hydrogen allowed even more passenger facilities to be added to the Hindenburg, so this perhaps offset the company's concerns. As they say, money talks. Service. Finally, after the years of construction, the Hindenburg was ready to begin its trials and subsequent revenue-earning service. The first trial flight took place on the 4th of March 1936. The first test flight carried 87 passengers, though they were not paying customers. Most were dockyard employees of the company, added to simulate the weight of a full complement. Also on board was Hugo Eckener and Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Breithaupt, who had experience during the Great War of piloting bomber zeppelins. Now, he was there as a representative of the German Air Ministry. Officially, the ship did not yet have a name, although the name Hindenburg was already decided upon by management. For the time being, she would be known as a designation number of DLZ-129, possibly to avoid embarrassment if anything went wrong during testing. But thankfully, nothing did. She was also adorned with the 5 Olympic rings as a way to promote the upcoming Berlin Games of 1936. Quite the impressive advertising banner. A couple of weeks later, on the 23rd of March, the now officially named Hindenburg began her maiden revenue-earning flight with 80 newspaper reporters aboard, along with a cargo of mail from Friedrichshafen to Löwenthal. As she passed over Lake Constance, she was joined for a time in the air by her running mate, the Graf Zeppelin. The Hindenburg, and later a sister known as the Graf Zeppelin II, launched in 1938, were to be the main transatlantic travel option between Europe and the Americas. Never one to miss out on the PR campaign opportunity, the German propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels did order the Hindenburg to drop propaganda leaflets to German citizens in the Rhineland, bordering France and Belgium, in late 1936. This was part of Hitler's plan to remilitarize the zone, which had been a term of the Locarno Pact, a set of agreements meant to curtail Germany's ability to easily wage war again, following on from the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, the plan worked, and a local referendum and subsequent election made up of only Nazi candidates were selected to represent the region in the Reichstag, and the zone was remilitarized later that year. Eckener was dead against the craft being used for such purposes, as he despised the Nazi Party and denounced them at every opportunity, even to the point where he loudly protested at the orders to paint swastikas on the Hindenburg tail fins. These protestations led to him being declared something of a persona non grata status when the Nazis banned the publication of anything that Eckener wrote or was quoted in. The higher-ups within the party had toyed with the idea of arresting Eckener as a political prisoner, but his celebrity and usefulness for designing more airships was enough to make the Nazis stay their hand. On the 26th of March, another propaganda flight was planned, along with Graf Zeppelin, but trouble reared its head. The Hindenburg was caught in a severe crosswind that caused the tail fin and lower rudder to dip sharply, scraping it along the ground and causing significant damage. This had come about because the captain, Ernst Lehmann, was determined to make a good show for the cameras, despite the less than favourable launch conditions. Lehmann was rebuked for his recklessness. The damage was quickly repaired, and the Hindenburg was moved to Löwenthal to begin its first commercial passenger flight to Rio de Janeiro. However, this trip was not without its problems. It was noticed that a large buildup of carbon deposits had accumulated around the engines from her previous slow-speed flights. This had caused one of her automatic gas valves for Cell 3 to seize in the open position a short time after takeoff on the return flight. The captain and crew acted quickly, with gas being transferred from other cells to level out the trim, but on top of this, 38 hours into the flight, number 4 engine on the forward port quarter suffered damage to its wrist pin, which broke the component and caused further damage to the engine and cylinders. Naturally, the crew shut down the engine to prevent any further problems, but only 4 hours later, number 2 engine, aft port, also went down. One of the 2 bearing cap bolts covering the crankshaft had failed, with the cap falling into the crank casing. The crew managed to extricate the failed component and restart the engine, but a little while later, when the ship was off Cape Juby in southern Morocco, the second bearing cap failed too, leading to a permanent shutdown of the engine until proper repairs could be effected. Hardly the auspicious start that the company were hoping for. Weather reports reached the Hindenburg's captain of severe winds over the English Channel, and so he ordered the craft to increase altitude, hoping to find more favourable trade winds at around 4,900 feet, which was actually above the safe operating ceiling. Thankfully, the winds they were looking for were found much lower, at only 3,600 feet, which allowed them to continue safely on. They asked permission from the French Air Ministry to pass directly over the Rhone Valley due to their engine problems. The request was granted, and the Hindenburg limped to her home berth for a total journey duration of 203 hours and 32 minutes flight time, or roughly 8.5 days. Once safely back, the engines were given a thorough overhaul, and the tail fin was modified to give it greater ground clearance. In all, throughout the travelling season of 1936, the Hindenburg made a total of 17 round trips to the Americas, 10 to the USA, and 7 to Brazil. On 2 occasions, she passed over the north of England, most notably the town of Keighley in West Yorkshire, whereupon a small parcel was thrown overboard. It was found by 2 young boys, Alfred Butler and Jack Gerard. There was a note inside, along with a small silver cross and a bunch of carnations. The note read, "To the finder of this letter, please deposit these flowers and cross on the grave of my dear brother, Lieutenant Franz Schulte, 1st Guard Regiment, Zufoss, POW in Skipton Cemetery in Keighley near Leeds. Many thanks for your kindness. John P. Schulte, the 1st Flying Priest." In July, the Hindenburg set a record for transatlantic travel between Frankfurt and Lakehurst, completing a full round trip in just 98 hours 28 minutes, or just over 8 days in total. The last trip of the season, on the 10th of October that year, was from Lakehurst, New Jersey. However, the first US trip of the 1937 season back to Lakehurst would end in the most horrific fashion. The disaster. The 1937 season had begun for the Hindenburg in late March with a round trip to Rio de Janeiro. 10 round trips were planned between Europe and the USA, with American Airlines reaching an agreement to ferry passengers from Lakehurst to Newark for other conventional airplane flights. The first US-bound flight of the Hindenburg's second season in operation was delayed due to strong headwinds that stunted her progress. But aside from that, the trip went off without much of a hitch, although there was some mild panic amongst the crew when they saw that a young boy had brought aboard with him a toy car. This car, when pushed along a surface, emitted sparks, because old-school toys were just awesome. Naturally, because of the danger that this potentially posed, the boy sadly had to have his favourite toy confiscated for the length of the trip. Hindenburg was well behind her scheduled time when she passed over Boston on the morning of the 6th of May. She was only carrying 36 passengers for the outbound trip, half of her total capacity. But the return trip was fully booked, as the following week was the coronation of King George VI, and despite them kicking out the British way back when, Americans still have a soft spot for British royalty. But these expectant passengers would not get to make the return journey, as disaster struck later in the day. Thunderstorms were currently pouring down over Lakehurst, and so Captain Max Pruss decided to fly further south over Manhattan whilst they waited for the weather to improve sufficiently for a safe landing in New Jersey. This gave New Yorkers a great spectacle to behold as the massive craft passed over their city, presumably while saying something along the lines of, "Hey Joey, check out the big fucking blimp!" Many dropping whatever they were doing to catch a glimpse of the famous airship. And of course, the passengers got to glimpse the famous Big Apple skyline from above. Only a few hours later, the great craft would be no more. 12 hours after her booked arrival time, the Hindenburg got word from Lakehurst that it was now safe for them to land. As the ship made her final approach at the mooring tower at 1900, the ship was at a high altitude of 650 feet, necessitated by the weather. The plan was to let go the mooring lines once they descended low enough, with teams of men scrambling to get hold of ropes that they could then attach to a winch and safely and gently bring the Hindenburg down to its mooring. This needed less ground crew, but took longer to execute. At 1909, the ship was forced to make a hard turn to port because the ground crew was not yet in position or ready for the descent maneuver. 2 minutes later, at 1911, she returned to her original course toward the tower and began venting some of her gas to gently decrease the altitude. 3 minutes later, Captain Pruss ordered the aft engines full astern to slow the ship's forward momentum. At 1917, a strong crosswind caused another sharp turn, this time to starboard. This was corrected back again a minute later, and Pruss ordered some of the ballast water from the aft tanks to be jettisoned, as well as some gas from the forward cells, as the ship's nose was too high. This failed to bring the ship's trim back to level. 6 men of the crew were sent forward to add their weight to the nose end. At 1921, the Hindenburg was only 298 feet off the ground, and the mooring lines were dropped. Some light rain had begun to fall by the time the lines were being attached to the waiting winches. 1925 was where the problem started. Witnesses claimed at that point that they saw a section of the ship's outer skin near the upper tail fin rippling, something which it should not be able to do, as it was supposed to be taut. Others also claimed to have seen a dim blue flame. At the same time, the crew on the bridge gondola car all heard a noise which sounded like a deep rumbling coming from within the ship, although they could not figure out what it was. Only a few seconds later, the stern of the ship erupted in flames. the back end of the ship dropped like a stone toward the ground, but the so far undamaged forward part of the airship was still pointing upwards. This bought the panicking passengers and crew precious seconds during which they could smash through the observation windows and make a jump for it when they got near the ground. As the tail of the Hindenburg crashed to the ground, a huge ball of flame shot out from the very tip of the ship's nose, and the angle of the front now lent itself to the fire spreading to the rest of the vessel. In only 30 to 40 seconds, the entirety of the largest aircraft in the world had been reduced to a hellish inferno of twisted metal that lay crumpled and limp on the ground, with flames and smoke spewing many hundreds of feet into the air. The whole scene was captured by newsreel cameras, who were on site to welcome the Hindenburg into her new season of trips. A reporter, Herbert Morrison, can be heard giving commentary on both the approach and subsequent disaster, with the camera capturing everything.
The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I can't talk to people. There's friends around there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying there, massive smoking wreckage. And everybody can't hardly breathe and talk and screaming. Lady, I'm sorry. Honestly, I can hardly breathe. I'm going to step inside while I cannot see it. Johnny, that's terrible. Listen, folks, I'm going to have to stop for a minute because I've lost the voice. This is the worst thing I've ever witnessed.
The sheer speed at which the whole ship was engulfed in flames is both astounding and sobering, and has become an iconic piece of footage. Herbert Morrison also recalled the fact that, due to assuming that everyone aboard must have died, as part of his commentary he was giving, he uttered the phrase, "Oh, the humanity." This phrase has gone on to become inextricably linked with the disaster. Aftermath, conclusions, and legacy. The fire would claim a total of 36 lives, a comparatively light butcher's bill given the overall size of the Hindenburg and the speed at which she was consumed, but nevertheless horrific. Certainly, it is well that the ship was not carrying a full complement of passengers, but we should also thank our respective deities for small graces and consider the fact that an astounding 62 people of the 96 total aboard were able to survive the disaster and get away from the raging inferno that was the wreckage. Quite how they managed that is something of a minor miracle. This was due to the very nature of the hydrogen gas. The fact that it was rising as soon as it escaped the gas cells pulled the flames upwards with it and not down towards the area where the passengers were at the bottom of the craft. This was a short but vital window of opportunity for many to escape the wreckage and run to safety. In examining just what exactly happened to cause the disaster, I cannot help but note the problems the crew were having with the tail becoming too heavy as they attempted to approach the mooring mast. Perhaps this was because one or more of the gas cells in the stern had ruptured and was leaking gas. It certainly is likely, given that where the fire erupted from, and would explain why the crew had difficulty in bringing the tail back up. It would also explain the rippling effect of the canvas skin that was seen by some of the ground crew. So it follows that the cells in the stern must have ruptured. But how? Well, I think it is down to the 2 sharp turns the ship made during her final approach. She was not designed to take drastic maneuvers like this, and it is likely that it put a lot of stress on the internal structure of the lightweight frame, which was braced with hundreds of miles of steel cables to act as tensioners. The most likely explanation is that the extreme force of torsion on the frame from the sharp turns was enough to snap one of these cables, which then whipped around like a blade and tore through the rearmost gas cell and the outer skin. But fire cannot begin without all 3 of the following components: fuel, oxygen, and heat that serves as ignition. Of course, we have the oxygen in the air, and the leaking hydrogen as the fuel, but where did the ignition come from? For this, we need to look at the eyewitnesses who claimed that they saw a mysterious dim blue flame. Was this the ignition that set the ball rolling, so to speak? This could be either caused by static electricity building up on the outer skin, or by a phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, not the John Parr song, or the movie that the song was made for that literally no one has ever seen. St. Elmo's fire is a phenomenon that occurs when a lightning strike causes a corona of plasma from the rapidly vaporizing water and superheated air around the top of a lightning rod or similar tall object. But even though there had been thunderstorms in the area a little while before, something like a lightning strike would have been seen by both witnesses and the news cameras, so that pretty much rules out lightning. Hugo Echner himself theorized that the ignition was almost certainly caused by a spark of static electricity. Due to the Hindenburg flying through stormy weather conditions over the Atlantic and the highly charged atmosphere around the landing area at the time of the disaster, a static charge could have easily built up on the outer surface of the skin. When the mooring ropes were dropped, the internal frame would have been grounded, but the skin would have not. And so, with the tear in the skin flapping around in the wind, the static then had the opportunity to jump from the outer skin to the metal frame to reach the ground, causing a spark that just so happened to be where the hydrogen was leaking. In all, a chain of unfortunate events conspired to create the perfect conditions for a fire that would engulf the Hindenburg, take 36 lives, and permanently end mankind's dalliance with airships as passenger carriers. It was just horrid luck. Due to the outbreak of war in 1939, it was decided to scrap the nearly complete Graf Zeppelin II, as its materials were sorely needed elsewhere, most notably the Luftwaffe, and until the war was concluded, there would be no commercial services anyway, and they couldn't use it for bombing as they had in the Great War, because aircraft were far more capable of easily hunting down the massive and painfully slow airships, which would have stood zero chance. Following the Hindenburg disaster, the world quickly lost its trust in airships, and damn near all major players decided to cease their programs, even helium-powered ones. In the modern day, airships are actually one of the safest forms of air travel, provided of course they're filled with helium. However, helium is still very expensive and a difficult commodity to come by, so it is unlikely that passenger-carrying airships will ever see a resurgence. Although we are still awed at the rare sight of a blimp, even if they have just been relegated to mundane duties, like advertising big companies. Perhaps it could be argued that, in doing so, they are still being used for propaganda, just in a much more subtle way, to make you buy more shit. I shall end this video with the names of those who lost their lives on that terrible day. Ernst Rudolf Anders, Birger Brink, Hermann Dörner, Irina Dörner, Bertis Dollan, Edward Douglas, Fritz Erdmann, Otto Ernst, Moritz Freibusch, Erich Knöcher, John Pannes, Emma Pannes, Otto Reichhold, Walter Barnsola, engine mechanic, Alfred Bernhard, helmsman, Rudi Bialas, engine mechanic, Wilhelm Dimmler, engineering officer, Fritz Eichelmann, radio officer, Ludwig Felber, elevator man, Fritz Flakus, cook, Albert Holderried, engine mechanic, Ernst Huckel, elevator man, Emily Imhoff, stewardess, Ludwig Knorr, chief rigger, Ernst Lehmann, officer, Robert Moser, engine mechanic, Richard Müller, cook, Alois Reissacker, engine mechanic, Willi Schief, engine mechanic, Ernst Schlapp, electrician, Josef Schreibmüller, engine mechanic, Max Schulze, steward, Willi Speck, chief radio officer, Erich Spell, rigger, and Alfred Sturkel, engine mechanic. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please hit the like button and share it far and wide to help it reach a bigger audience. Check out my back catalogue to see even more great documentaries like this one from the dark side of history. And a huge thank you to those of you who have joined the Dark Legion, which now stands at a staggering 60,000 plus strong. You've no idea how blown away I am at reading that milestone only 2 years after I started uploading. I cannot even begin to express just how grateful I am to each and every one of you for putting me where I am today. I shall never lose sight of that. I promise you. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon or via the Super Thanks button, or you can become a member of the channel. All 3 of these options help support everything I do here, making these videos for you. Massive props to everyone who has supported me so far. You have no idea how humbled I am at the faith you put in me. Check out my alternate channel DID Reads for even more sexy, buttery voiced narration content. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.